So glad you're back. I've got a crazy tale for you today.
Julian Vance laughed as he poured a glass of $1,000 champagne over Elena Vance's grease-stained boots in front of the entire charity gala. The golden liquid hissed against the heavy leather, pooling on the white marble floor of the Vance estate. A dozen socialites paused, their silk gowns rustling like dry leaves as they turned to witness the spectacle. "Oops," Julian said, his voice dripping with a mock sympathy that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He adjusted his silk bow tie, looking every bit the golden heir the city adored. "I forgot we don't have a service entrance for the help. But then again, you always did prefer the smell of diesel to decent society, didn't you, Elena?" Elena didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, the scent of expensive lilies in the foyer clashing with the faint, persistent aroma of motor oil that lived in her skin. Her work shirt, though clean, was faded at the collar, a stark bruise against the sea of tuxedos. She looked at the puddle on her boots, then up at her brother. "The generator is fixed, Julian," she said, her voice low and steady. It was the voice of someone who understood how gears turned and how structures collapsed. "You might want to tell the caterers. They can stop panicking about the ice sculptures melting." "Is that what you're calling yourself now? A generator mechanic?" Julian stepped closer, leaning in so only she could smell the expensive gin on his breath. "Father only invited you because he didn't want the neighbors wondering why the black sheep was sleeping in a shipyard warehouse. Do us all a favor, stay in the kitchen. You're embarrassing the name." Across the room, Silas Vance stood by the grand staircase, swirling a glass of scotch. He didn't intervene. He simply watched, his face a mask of practiced disappointment. To Silas, Elena was a broken component in a machine he had spent 40 years perfecting. Julian was the shiny, functional facade. Elena was the grit in the engine. Near the buffet, Sarah Jenkins, the city's most formidable social columnist, adjusted her glasses. Her pen remained poised over her leather-bound notebook. She wasn't looking at the champagne-soaked boots. She was watching the way Elena's eyes remained flat, devoid of the tears Julian was clearly fishing for. "Elena," Silas called out, his voice carrying the weight of a command. "Apologize to your brother for the interruption. Then go wash up. You look like you've been crawling through a sewer." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd. Elena felt the heat of a dozen judgmental stares, but her hand stayed steady in her pocket, her thumb brushing the cold, titanium edge of an encrypted burner phone. "I'm not the one who caused the interruption, Father," she said. Julian's face flushed a deep, angry red. He hated it when she used that tone, the one that suggested she knew something he didn't. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the muscle. "You've got a lot of nerve, showing up here looking like a vagrant and talking back. I should have you thrown out." "You could try," Elena replied. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her voice a razor-thin whisper. "But if you do, who's going to tell you why the Morty Syndicate's lead security auditor is currently standing in your driveway?" Julian froze. The name Morty acted like a physical blow, draining the color from his cheeks. Everyone in the high finance world knew the name. Don Lorenzo Morty didn't just own half the docks, he owned the people who owned the banks. "What are you talking about?" Julian hissed, his grip loosening. "The man in the gray suit by the fountain," Elena said, nodding toward the window. "He isn't here for the auction. He's here because someone has been skimming from the construction funds for the new waterfront development. Someone who thinks they're a lot smarter than they actually are." Julian's eyes darted toward the window, his bravado flickering like a dying bulb. He looked back at Elena, his mouth opening and closing. "You're lying. You're just a mechanic. You don't know anything about the Mortys." Elena's phone vibrated against her hip. A single, short pulse. A text from Marco back at the shipyard, but the routing was syndicate-heavy. "The ghost is cleared for entry. The dawn is waiting." She finally stepped back, the champagne on her boots beginning to feel cold. She looked at her father, who was already turning away to greet a local senator, then back at Julian. The golden fraud was sweating now, the fine sheen of moisture on his forehead catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. "I'm going to the kitchen now, Julian," Elena said, her voice devoid of emotion. I need to wash this champagne off. It's a waste of a good vintage. She turned and walked away, her heavy boots thudding rhythmically against the marble, a blue-collar beat in a high-society ballroom. She didn't look back at the whispers or the sneers. As she passed through the swinging doors into the service hallway, the air grew cooler, smelling of roasted meats and industrial cleanser. She pulled the burner phone from her pocket and swiped the screen. She didn't call a lawyer. She didn't call the police. She dialed a number that wasn't in any public directory. "Don Lorenzo," she said when the line picked up. Her voice had changed. The submissive daughter was gone. The ghost architect had arrived. "The security bypass is active. Julian has no idea the back door is open. You can start the audit whenever you're ready." She paused, listening to the deep, gravelly chuckle on the other end of the line. "And Don," Elena added, watching a drop of champagne fall from her boot onto the linoleum floor. "Make sure it hurts. I want him to watch everything he thinks he owns turn to ash." She hung up and leaned against the cold, stainless steel prep table. Outside, the music of the gala continued, but the countdown had already begun. 2 days until the board meeting. 2 days until the Vance legacy was dismantled piece by piece. Elena reached for a rag and began to wipe the grease from her hands, her eyes fixed on the door. She could wait. She had spent years learning how to wait. The next morning, the first of the subpoenas would arrive, and Julian Vance would realize that the sister he had treated like trash was the only person who could have saved him, and the only one who had made sure he was beyond saving. The next morning, the sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vance Global Executive Suite, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished mahogany conference table. Elena Vance stood by the chrome espresso machine, her simple charcoal blazer a stark contrast to the opulence of the room. She could still feel the phantom weight of the grease under her fingernails from the shipyard, a sensation that felt more honest than anything in this building. The heavy double doors swung open, and Julian Vance strode in, radiating the kind of unearned confidence that only came from a lifetime of being told he was the son. He didn't look at her. Instead, he adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of a glass-fronted awards cabinet. "You're early," he said, his voice dripping with a casual, practiced boredom. "Though I suppose when you live in a warehouse, a climate-controlled office feels like a luxury vacation." Elena didn't take the bait. She watched him through the steam of her cup. "The board meeting starts in an hour, Julian. I thought we should review the infrastructure budget." He finally turned, a smirk playing on his lips. He walked toward her. The scent of overexpensive sandalwood cologne preceded him like a warning. He stopped just inside her personal space, looking down at her sensible shoes. "Infrastructure? Is that what we're calling your little hobby now? I've already handled the budget. In fact, I've simplified it." He tossed a thick leather-bound folder onto the table. The heavy thud echoed in the silent room. Elena stepped forward and flipped it open. Her heart didn't skip a beat. It turned to ice. "You're liquidating the shipyard assets," she said, her voice a flat line. "It's a liability, Elena. It's a rusted relic of a father's sentimental phase. We're selling the land to a luxury condo developer. The warehouse, your home, will be rubble by the end of the month." He leaned against the table, crossing his ankles. "I've already invited Sarah Jenkins to the announcement this afternoon. A nice human interest piece. Vance Global pivots to the future." The door opened again, and Silas Vance entered. Their father looked older, his eyes constantly darting toward Julian for approval. He didn't even meet Elena's gaze as he sat at the head of the table. "Dad, did you see this?" Elena asked, gesturing to the folder. "The shipyard is the only part of this company that actually produces something tangible. It's our history." Silas sighed, the sound of a man who had long ago traded his spine for a seat at the table. "Julian has a vision, Elena. We need to be lean. We can't have you playing mechanic on company time anymore. It's embarrassing. People in our circle are starting to talk." "People like who?" Elena asked. "The ones Julian buys drinks for with money the company hasn't actually made yet." Julian's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine, jagged heat. He stepped toward her, his voice dropping to a hiss. Watch yourself. You're only in this room because of the name on your birth certificate, a name you've spent years dragging through the mud of that shipyard. You're a ghost, Elena, and ghosts don't get a vote. He reached out, flicking a stray piece of lint off her shoulder with a gesture of profound dismissiveness. Go back to your engines. Enjoy the smell of diesel while you still can. You have 48 hours to clear out your lockers. Elena felt the familiar sting of her nails digging into her palms. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She simply reached into her pocket and felt the cold, hard edge of her encrypted phone. A small vibration hummed against her thigh, a message from Marco. The forensic auditors are through the first firewall. Dawn says the lions are hungry. 48 hours, Elena repeated softly. She looked at her father, who was busy staring at a speck of dust on his sleeve, then back to Julian. That's a lot of time for things to change. Julian laughed, a sharp, barking sound that didn't reach his eyes. Nothing changes for people like you. You lose, Elena. You've been losing since the day you decided you were too good for this family's performative status, as you called it. Well, this status is what's taking your home away. He turned his back on her, dismissing her existence entirely as he began to pull up a slide deck for the board. Elena didn't wait for the meeting to start. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the marble floor. In the lobby, she passed Sarah Jenkins, who was busy checking her lighting in a compact mirror. The journalist looked up, a predatory glint in her eyes. "Elena, any comment on the big pivot Julian is announcing?" Elena paused, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Just one, Sarah. Tell your readers to keep their eyes on the Vance global stock price tomorrow morning. It's going to be a historic day." She walked out into the humid city air, the smell of rain and exhaust a welcome relief from the suffocating sandalwood. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number she had memorized years ago. "Marco," she said, watching a black sedan with tinted windows pull up to the curb. "Tell Don Lorenzo the audit is no longer a suggestion. I want the Vance global internal servers bled dry by midnight. Julian thinks he's selling my home. I want him to realize he doesn't even own the chair he's sitting in." She stepped into the back of the sedan. As the door closed with a heavy, armored thud, she looked up at the glass tower. The countdown hadn't just begun. The fuse was already a quarter of the way gone. Julian had no idea that the sister he had just evicted was the only thing standing between him and the abyss, and she had just stepped out of the way. 2 days had passed since the black sedan had disappeared into the city's industrial veins, and the air in the shipyard warehouse now smelled of ozone and burnt coffee. Elena stood over a workstation, her grease-stained shirt a sharp contrast to the high-tech glowing monitors reflecting in her dark eyes. Marco leaned against the steel doorframe, his arms crossed over a chest that still bore the scars of his time in the syndicate. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The steady hum of the cooling fans and the rhythmic scrolling of encrypted data on the screens told the story. "The servers are bled dry," Marco said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against the corrugated metal walls. "Every offshore account, every shell company Julian used to hide the Vance global liabilities. It's all on this drive." He held up a small, unassuming black USB stick. To anyone else, it was a piece of plastic. To Elena, it was the detonator for the bomb Julian had spent a decade building. She took the drive, the cold metal casing grounding her. She could feel the weight of it, the years of being sidelined, the nights spent fixing Julian's miracles while he took the credit, and the final insult of him trying to sell the roof over her head. She tucked it into the hidden pocket of her work vest. "Don Lorenzo wants to know if you're ready," Marco added, his gaze lingering on the armored sedan parked in the shadows of the warehouse. "Tell the Don that the amnesty expires at noon tomorrow," Elena replied, her voice as cold as the shipyard's morning fog. "Julian had his chance to be a brother. Now he's just a target." The transition from the industrial grit of the shipyard to the suffocating opulence of the Vance family estate was a sensory assault. 3 hours later, Elena pulled her battered truck up the long, winding driveway, the engine's rattle echoing off the manicured hedges. The scent of blooming jasmine and expensive mulch hung heavy in the air, a perfume designed to mask the rot underneath. Julian stood on the grand portico, flanked by Silas and Margaret. They were surrounded by a small group of people, a high-end real estate agent, a couple of potential buyers in tailored charcoal suits, and Sarah Jenkins, who was already scribbling in a leather-bound notebook. Julian looked every bit the golden heir, his hair perfectly coiffed, wearing a navy blazer that cost more than Elena's truck. As she stepped out of the vehicle, the sound of her heavy work boots on the pristine gravel was like a gunshot. Julian's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed with a predatory gleam. "Ah, the prodigal mechanic returns," Julian said, his voice projected perfectly for the benefit of the guests. He gestured toward Elena with a champagne flute, the crystal catching the afternoon sun. "I hope you're here to collect the rest of your tools, Elena. We're showing the property to people who actually appreciate the architecture, not just the square footage of the garage." Silas cleared his throat, looking everywhere but at his daughter. "Elena, really, you could have at least changed. We have guests." "I'm not here for the house, Silas," she said, her tone level. She walked toward the group, her presence a dark smudge on their bright, performative tableau. Julian stepped forward, invading her personal space. He smelled of expensive sandalwood and unearned confidence. He leaned in, lowering his voice so only she could hear, though the smirk remained for the audience. "You look pathetic, Elena, like a stray dog begging for a scrap. Did you think Don Lorenzo would actually help you? You're a grease monkey. You're a liability. Tomorrow, when the Vance global merger is announced, I'm going to have you trespassed from every property with our name on it. You'll be lucky if I let you keep the shipyard." He turned back to the real estate agent, his voice booming again. "Forgive my sister. She's always struggled with the concept of upward mobility. She prefers the dirt." The guests chuckled politely, a few of them casting pitying glances at Elena. Sarah Jenkins watched the exchange with a sharp, calculating intensity, her pen paused over the paper. Elena didn't flinch. She felt the hard edge of the USB drive against her hip. She looked at Julian, seeing not the brother she had once protected, but the fraud he had become. "You're right about one thing, Julian," she said, her voice carrying easily across the portico. "The merger tomorrow is going to be historic, but you should check the internal server logs before you sign anything. Sometimes the things you think you've buried have a way of surfacing when the tide goes out." Julian's laughter was sharp and dismissive. "Internal logs? I have a team of Ivy League analysts for that. I don't need advice from someone who spends her day under a chassis. Go back to your warehouse, Elena. The adults are talking." He turned his back on her, a dismissal so complete it was meant to be a final blow. He began leading the group toward the grand foyer, pointing out the crown molding and the marble imported from Italy. Elena stayed exactly where she was. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text to Marco. "Initiate the countdown." Midnight. She watched them disappear into the house, her father, her mother, and the brother who had sold her out for a seat at a table that was about to collapse. She could almost taste the irony. It was thick and metallic, like the air before a lightning strike. Julian was so busy selling the house that he hadn't realized he'd already lost the foundation. As she walked back to her truck, she caught Sarah's eye. The journalist lingered near the fountain, her expression unreadable. Elena gave her a small, tight nod. "Tomorrow morning, Sarah," Elena said quietly as she passed. "Make sure you're at the exchange. You won't want to miss the opening bell." She climbed into the truck, the vinyl seat hot against her skin. She looked at the clock on the dashboard. 18 hours. In 18 hours, Julian would realize that the sister he had evicted was the only one who held the keys to his kingdom, and she had just changed the locks. The engine roared to life, a low, guttural snarl that drowned out the polite conversation coming from the house, and Elena drove away without looking back. The morning before the exchange, the shipyard warehouse felt like a pressure cooker. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and burnt oil, a sharp, metallic tang that Elena Vance had come to find more comforting than the cloying floral perfumes of the family estate. She stood at a heavy workbench, her fingers stained with grease as she methodically cleaned a set of industrial gears. Each movement was precise, a silent countdown to the moment the world would tilt on its axis. The heavy steel door at the far end of the warehouse groaned open, letting in a shaft of blinding harbor light. The sound of Italian leather shoes clacking against the concrete floor signaled an intrusion that didn't belong in this world of iron and sweat. Julian Vance stepped into the workspace, his designer suit looking absurdly out of place against the backdrop of rusted hulls and heavy machinery. He adjusted his silk tie, his nose wrinkling in visible disgust. "I see you've finally found your level, Elena," Julian said, his voice echoing off the high rafters. He gestured vaguely at the oil-stained floor and the looming skeletons of ships. "Living in a shipyard hovel, surrounded by scrap metal. It's a fitting end for the daughter who couldn't keep up with the family's standards." Elena didn't look up from her work. She felt the cold weight of the burner phone in her pocket, the direct line to Don Lorenzo Morty, and it gave her a sense of calm that Julian's petty barbs couldn't touch. "Standards are a matter of perspective, Julian. Some people value what they build. Others only value what they can steal." Julian laughed, a sharp, entitled sound that made the hair on the back of Elena's neck stand up. "Steal? I'm the one saving the Vance legacy while you hide in the shadows." Father and Margaret are already picking out the guest list for the celebration gala. "We're moving the final papers at 10 tomorrow morning. I just came by to make sure you weren't planning on showing your face and embarrassing us one last time." Marco stepped out from behind a massive crane assembly, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. He didn't say a word, but his presence, the silent, lethal weight of a man who had survived the Morty Syndicate's toughest years, made Julian flinch. The financier took a step back, his bravado flickering for a split second before his arrogance took over again. "Is this what you've resorted to?" Julian sneered, regaining his footing. "Hiring thugs to play bodyguard. It doesn't change the fact that by noon tomorrow, the estate will be sold, the debt will be cleared, and you'll be nothing more than a footnote in my success story. You're a mechanic, Elena. You fix things that are broken. You don't understand how the real world of power works." Elena finally set the gear down and turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of professional indifference. "I understand power better than you think. That's why I'm giving you one warning, Julian, just one. Double-check the title search on the estate. Make sure every signature is exactly where it's supposed to be before you stand in front of that board tomorrow." Julian's lip curled into a dismissive smirk. He didn't even pause to consider the weight of her words. "You're pathetic. Trying to scare me with legal ghost stories? I have the best lawyers Sela's could buy. The deal is airtight. You're just bitter because you're standing on the outside looking in." He turned on his heel, his shoes clicking sharply as he headed back toward the door. "Enjoy the grease, sister. It's all you have left." Elena watched him go, the silhouette of his expensive suit shrinking against the light. She knew Sarah Jenkins was already drafting the lead for tomorrow's financial column, and that the airtight deal Julian bragged about was actually a noose he had spent weeks tying around his own neck. "He didn't listen," Marco grunted, stepping up beside her. "He never does," Elena replied softly. She looked at the clock on the warehouse wall. 14 hours. The opening bell was less than a day away, and for the first time in years, she wasn't the one who was going to be broken. She picked up the heavy steel wrench again, the cold metal a promise of the justice to come. Julian thought he was selling the family's past, but by tomorrow morning, he would realize he had already signed away his future. The evening of the shipyard gala arrived with a chilling fog that rolled off the Atlantic, cloaking the harbor in a gray shroud. Inside the Maritime Plaza, however, the atmosphere was a fever dream of gold leaf and crystal. The grand ballroom hummed with the low, predatory vibration of high society gossip and the sharp clink of expensive champagne flutes. Julian Vance stood at the center of the room, his chest puffed out beneath a tailored tuxedo that likely cost more than a year's rent for most of the shipyard workers. He was holding court, surrounded by a gaggle of investors who hung on his every word as if he were handing out bars of gold. Elena Vance entered the foyer an hour after the festivities began. She had traded her grease-stained work shirt for a floor-length gown of midnight silk that clung to her frame like a second skin. It was a gift from the Morty estate, delivered in a box that smelled of cedar and old power. As she stepped onto the polished granite floor, the rhythmic click of her heels echoed against the high ceilings, a steady, metronomic sound that felt like a countdown. She didn't look like the grease monkey Julian had mocked just hours ago. She looked like a ghost haunting her own funeral, or perhaps a predator walking into a pen of well-dressed sheep. "Look what the tide washed in," Julian sneered, his voice cutting through the ambient music as she approached the VIP circle. He didn't even bother to lower his glass. He scanned her from head to toe, his eyes dripping with a condescending sort of pity. "I must say, the dress is a vast improvement, Elena. Did you have to pawn your last set of wrenches to afford the rental, or did you just find it in the lost and found of a better neighborhood?" A few of the investors chuckled, their eyes darting between the two siblings. Silas Vance, standing just behind his son, adjusted his cufflinks with a look of profound disappointment. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply looked through her as if she were a smudge on the window of his ambition. "You're late," he muttered, his voice cold. "Try not to embarrass your brother tonight. This is the biggest deal of his career. The least you can do is stay in the shadows and keep your mouth shut." Elena didn't flinch. She felt the weight of the encrypted drive in her clutch bag, a secret power that made her spine feel like it was made of tempered steel. She took a glass of water from a passing waiter, her fingers steady. "I wouldn't dream of overshadowing him, Father," she said, her voice a calm, dangerous silk. "I'm just here to see the finale. It's not every day a man sells a legacy he didn't build." Julian's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He stepped closer, the scent of expensive bourbon and arrogance radiating off him. "I built the future while you were playing in the dirt," he hissed, leaning in so only she could hear. "By tomorrow morning, the shipyard will be a memory, and you'll be nothing but a footnote in my biography. You don't belong in this room, Elena. You never did. You're just a mechanic with a famous last name, and tonight I'm stripping you of even that." He turned his back on her, dismissing her with the casual cruelty he had practiced since childhood. But as he walked away to greet a new arrival, the room suddenly went quiet. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open, and Don Lorenzo Morty stepped inside. The atmosphere shifted instantly. It wasn't just respect that filled the air. It was a primal, bone-deep fear. The authority of the city didn't attend galas for the hors d'oeuvres. Julian's eyes lit up with a desperate, hungry greed. He smoothed his jacket and began to move toward the Don, his hand already extended for a sycophantic shake. He saw the Morty name as a stepping stone, a way to validate the fraud he had spent months constructing. He didn't notice that Don Lorenzo didn't even look at him. The older man's gaze swept the room, ignoring the outstretched hands and the fawning smiles, until his eyes locked onto Elena. A small, imperceptible nod passed between them. It was a silent validation that went unnoticed by the crowd, but to Elena, it felt like the firing of a starting pistol. She watched as Marco, dressed in a surprisingly sharp suit, positioned himself near the sound booth. He caught her eye and tapped his watch. 10 minutes. The countdown was no longer in hours, it was in heartbeats. Sarah Jenkins was already circling the perimeter, her digital recorder hidden in a silk wrap. She caught Elena's eye and gave a sharp, professional wink. The journalist had seen the airtight documents Elena had leaked to her earlier that evening. She knew that the financial column for the morning edition wasn't a success story. It was an obituary for a career built on theft. Julian reached the Don and began his pitch, his voice rising in an attempt to command the room's attention. "Don Lorenzo, a pleasure. As we discussed, the shipyard acquisition is finalized. We're just waiting for the ceremonial signing to make it official. It's a new era for the Vance name." Don Lorenzo took a sip of his wine, his expression unreadable. "A new era," he repeated, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "Indeed, though I find that eras often end much faster than people expect." Julian laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound that betrayed his internal panic. He didn't understand the subtext. He was too blinded by the glare of the chandeliers to see the shadow falling over him. He checked his gold watch, then looked toward the stage where a podium had been set up for his grand announcement. "If you'll excuse me, it's time to address the board. I have a few words prepared for the occasion." He marched toward the stage with the confidence of a king ascending a throne, unaware that he was walking toward a scaffold. Elena stood near the back of the room, her hand resting on the cold marble of a pillar. She could feel the anticipation thickening in the air, a heavy electric charge that made the hair on her arms stand up. The trap was fully formed, the bait was taken, and Julian was currently adjusting the microphone. "Wait for it," she whispered to herself, the words tasting like the finest vintage. She looked at the clock on the wall. The opening bell of the truth was about to ring, and for the first time in her life, Elena Vance wasn't the one who was going to be broken. She watched as Julian tapped the mic, the feedback echoing through the silent room like a crack of thunder. He cleared his throat, flashed a winning smile at the cameras, and prepared to deliver the lie that would end him. The feedback from the microphone was still echoing through the ballroom when Julian Vance leaned into the podium, his smile wide and predatory. He looked every bit the golden heir, the sapphire silk of his suit shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. He began to speak, his voice smooth as expensive bourbon, weaving a tale of his own brilliance and the difficult sacrifices he'd made to secure the shipyard deal. He mentioned the hard work of his team, but his eyes found Elena Vance in the back of the room, flashing with a cruel, silent victory. "Leadership requires a certain pedigree," he said, his tone dripping with condescension as he gestured vaguely toward her. "Some people are built for the grease and the shadows of the shipyard, while others are destined to shape the skyline of this city. We must all know our place." A few of the board members chuckled, the sound like dry leaves skittering across the marble floor. Silas Vance beamed from the front row, nodding in fervent agreement, his pride in his son acting as a physical barrier against his daughter's existence. He looked at his son as if he were a god, completely ignoring the woman whose blueprints had made the moment possible. Elena didn't look away. She didn't flush with shame or lower her gaze. Instead, she caught the eye of Marco, who was standing near the technician's booth. He gave a single, sharp nod and tapped a sequence into the control tablet he held hidden against his thigh. The promotional video behind the podium cut to black. A second later, it wasn't a sleek architectural render that filled the 60-foot screen, but a series of high-resolution bank transfers and encrypted ledgers. The headers were unmistakable, the Morty Syndicate. Beneath them, in agonizing detail, were the records of Julian's systematic theft, $40 million funneled into offshore accounts to cover his spiraling gambling debts, all authorized with his digital signature. The room didn't just go quiet. It became a vacuum, sucking the air out of the lungs of every socialite and politician present. Julian turned, his practiced smirk dissolving as he saw the evidence of his treason displayed for the world to see. The transformation was haunting. The vibrant, healthy color drained from his face in a sickening rush, leaving his skin the hue of spoiled milk. His eyes, once bright with arrogance, stretched wide until the whites showed all the way around, his pupils vibrating with a primal, frantic terror. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, wet twitch that made him look suddenly, pathetically old. A thick bead of sweat broke from his forehead, carving a jagged path through his foundation and dripping onto his silk tie, while his hands gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned the color of bone. He looked like a man watching his own execution in real time, his chest heaving with shallow, jagged gasps that whistled in the absolute silence of the hall. Sarah Jenkins was the first to break the spell, the flash of her camera strobing against Julian's pale skin. "Mr. Vance, are these the sacrifices you were referring to?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. Silas Vance surged to his feet, his face contorting from confusion to a mask of pure, humiliated rage. He looked at the screen, then at his son, his mouth working but no sound coming out as he realized his legacy had just been incinerated in front of the city's elite. To his right, Don Lorenzo Morty remained perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Julian with the cold, clinical detachment of a butcher weighing a carcass. The board members at the head table didn't just look away. They physically recoiled, shifting their chairs inches at a time to create a dead zone around the man they had been applauding moments ago. Elena walked down the center aisle, the heavy soles of her boots thudding against the floor in a steady, industrial rhythm that drowned out the frantic whispers of the crowd. She stopped at the base of the stage, looking up at the brother who had spent years treating her like a ghost in her own life. "You always said I didn't belong in your world, Julian," she said, her voice calm and chillingly clear. "You were right. I don't belong in a world built on lies. But since I'm the one who actually holds the deed to this building and the debt on your life, I think it's time you moved out of mine." She didn't wait for the security team or the syndicate's enforcers to reach the stage. She turned her back on the wreckage of the Vance name, walking toward the grand oak doors without a single backward glance. Julian's voice cracked, a sharp, ugly sound that tore through the stunned silence of the gala hall. He pointed a trembling finger at the projection screen, his face a mottled shade of purple that clashed violently with his silk tie. He tried to laugh, a desperate, wheezing sound that convinced no one. He looked at Sela's, then at the rows of wealthy donors and board members, searching for a single nodding head or a sympathetic gaze. He found only a wall of cold, judging eyes. "This is a fabrication," Julian shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted marble ceiling. "She's a mechanic, a grease monkey. She hacked the system. Sela's, tell them she's lying." Sela's Vance didn't speak. He stood frozen, his glass of vintage Bordeaux shaking so hard the dark liquid sloshed over the rim, staining his white cuff. He looked at the bank statements displayed in 20-foot-tall letters, the clear, undeniable trail of Julian's embezzlement, and the legal documents proving Elena held the deed to the very floor they stood on. Julian's features seemed to melt under the harsh glow of the projector. The golden boy facade didn't just crack, it disintegrated. His eyes, usually sharp with calculated malice, became glassy and unfocused, darting around the room like a trapped animal. The skin around his mouth twitched uncontrollably, a rhythmic spasm that betrayed his mounting terror. His shoulders, always held with an artificial, puffed-up pride, slumped forward until he looked half his usual size. A bead of sweat broke from his hairline, carving a path through his expensive foundation, revealing the pale, sickly complexion of a man who realized his life was a hollow shell. He looked fragile, old, and utterly defeated. The arrogance that had defined him for decades evaporated, leaving behind a shivering, hollow man who couldn't even meet his sister's gaze. Elena stood at the base of the stage, her grease-stained work shirt a defiant smudge of reality against the backdrop of black-tie opulence. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The weight of the truth was doing the work for her. She felt the cold, crisp edges of the original deed in her pocket, a tactile reminder that the shipyard warehouse she called home was now the only thing the Vance family didn't own. "The audit is already in the hands of the district attorney, Julian," Elena said, her voice carrying easily through the hushed room. "And the board of directors received the full digital file 5 minutes ago." Sarah Jenkins stepped forward from the crowd, her camera lens reflecting the damning evidence on the screen. The flash went off, a strobe light of public execution. "Mr. Vance," the journalist said, her voice professional and predatory, "can you explain why $5 million of the employee pension fund was diverted to your offshore account last Tuesday?" Julian stumbled back, his heel catching on the edge of a floral arrangement. It was a bridge loan. Temporary. I was going to replace it." "With what?" Don Lorenzo Morty's voice cut through the air like a blade. The Don stepped out from the shadows of the VIP lounge, his tailored charcoal suit making him look like a shadow given form. He walked with a slow, predatory grace toward the stage. "Your credit lines are frozen, Julian. I personally saw to it. And as for the debt you owe the syndicate for your investments, that's been called in full, tonight." The room seemed to grow colder. Sela's Vance took a deliberate step away from his son. The betrayal in the older man's eyes wasn't for Elena's sake. It was the look of a man realizing he'd backed the losing horse. Margaret followed suit, her hand dropping from Julian's arm as if he'd suddenly become contagious. She adjusted her pearls, her gaze shifting to Elena with a terrifying, opportunistic glimmer of hope. "Elena, darling," Margaret began, her voice trembling with a forced, honeyed sweetness. "We had no idea he was being so reckless. You know, we've always seen your potential." "Don't," Elena interrupted, the single word hitting like a physical blow. She looked at her mother, then at the father who had spent years treating her like an unwanted ghost. "The locks on the Vance estate are being changed as we speak. Marco is overseeing the transition. You have until midnight to collect your personal effects. Anything left behind will be auctioned to cover Julian's legal fees." Julian let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated ruin. He reached out to grab the podium for support, but his hand slipped, and he tumbled to his knees. The golden fraud was literally in the dirt, surrounded by the very people he had spent his life looking down upon. Elena looked down at him, her expression one of profound, icy calm. She thought of the years of sabotage, the sneers about her filthy work, and the way he had tried to bury her dreams under his own ego. "You always told me I didn't belong in your world, Julian," she said, her voice a low, steady hum that commanded the entire hall. "You were right. I don't. Because in my world, we build things to last. You only know how to steal what others have built." She turned her back on him, the sound of her heavy work boots echoing with a rhythmic finality against the marble. She didn't look at the board members trying to shake her hand, or her parents who were now calling her name with desperate, hollow affection. She walked toward the grand oak doors, her head held high. Behind her, the sound of Julian's frantic pleading was drowned out by the collective murmur of a society that had already forgotten he existed. As she pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the cool night air, Elena pulled her phone from her pocket and made one final call. "Marco," she said, watching the city lights shimmer in the distance. "It's done. Clear the office. We're moving the headquarters to the shipyard tomorrow." She ended the call and didn't look back. The Vance name was a ruin, but the ghost architect was finally standing on her own foundation. 6 months had passed since the night the Vance name shattered like cheap glass under a hammer. The dust had finally settled, but the landscape of the city's elite had been permanently altered. Elena stood on the steel-grated catwalk of her shipyard headquarters, the rhythmic thrum of a hydraulic press vibrating through the soles of her boots. The air here didn't smell of expensive lilies or aged scotch. It smelled of salt spray, burnt ozone, and the honest grease of hard work. It was the first time in years she felt she could breathe without a corset of lies tightening around her ribs. Marco climbed the stairs, his heavy footsteps echoing against the metal. He handed her a sleek, matte black tablet, his face splitting into a grin that crinkled the scars on his forearms. He didn't need to say much. The screen displayed the final signatures on the municipal contract for the new harbor redevelopment. The ghost architect was no longer a myth whispered in syndicate backrooms. She was the lead contractor for the city's largest infrastructure project in a decade. She had built this without a single cent of the Vance inheritance, and the victory tasted better than any vintage champagne. "The old man called again," Marco said, his voice dropping an octave. "Your father, he's still trying to get through the secondary firewall." She didn't even look at the screen. Silas and Margaret Vance were currently living in a 2-bedroom condo in a suburb they used to mock. The estate had been liquidated to cover the mountain of debt Julian had hidden behind his fraudulent investments. Her parents had spent 30 years building a pedestal of social standing, only to find themselves sitting on the curb. They didn't want their daughter, they wanted a lifeline. She had sent them a single check, enough for a modest retirement, but not a penny more. It was the price of their silence during her years of exile. "Block the number, Marco," she said quietly. "I'm done paying for ghosts." Across town, in a cramped, fluorescent-lit office that smelled of stale coffee and desperation, Julian Vance stared at a stack of filing folders. He wasn't wearing a bespoke Italian suit today. He wore a mass-produced polyester blend that chafed at his neck. His hands, once used to gesturing grandly in boardrooms, were stained with ink from a temperamental copier. "Vance! The reports were due 10 minutes ago," a man half his age shouted from a glass-walled cubicle. He flinched, his shoulders hunching. He had tried to use his name to secure a loan, a favor, even a seat at a restaurant, but Sarah Jenkins had done her job too well. Her 3-part exposé on the golden fraud had turned his name into a social contagion. In this office, he wasn't a titan of finance. He was a low-level clerk with a tainted history, kept on only because the manager enjoyed having a former millionaire fetch his lunch. He reached for a lukewarm cup of water, his fingers trembling. He had lost the cars, the clubs, and the respect he never truly earned. Now, his only legacy was the silence of a phone that never rang. Later that evening, Sarah Jenkins met her at a small, quiet pier far from the glittering lights of the downtown gala. The journalist looked tired but satisfied, clutching a copy of the evening edition. "Don Lorenzo Morty sends his regards," Sarah said, leaning against the railing. "He wanted you to know that the shipyard's security permits were fast-tracked. He considers it a graduation gift." She nodded, looking out at the dark water. The Mafia boss had been the only father figure who hadn't asked her to shrink herself for a man's ego. But even that connection came with a shadow. To keep her empire, she would always have one foot in the darkness Lorenzo inhabited. It was the cost of her sovereignty, a weight she carried as surely as the grease under her fingernails. "And Julian?" she asked, the question tasting like ash. "He's exactly where he belongs," Sarah replied. "Invisible." She turned away from the city skyline, toward the glowing amber lights of her workshop. She had won. The Vance ruins were behind her, and her own foundation was set in stone and steel. But as she watched the distant silhouette of the family estate, now being gutted to become a public park, she felt the sharp, cold sting of the price she'd paid. She was the architect of her own life, but she was standing in a house of one. She pulled her jacket tighter against the rising wind, turned her back on the past, and walked toward the heat of the forge.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.